All right. Well, I appreciate everyone being here, taking a few minutes out of your evening to talk about, well, really kind of get up to speed on how the legislative process works in South Carolina. In case you don't know who I am, I'm a former state legislator. I have served in the South Carolina House of Representatives for the past 8 years. I live in the upstate part of South Carolina, in Anderson County, in a little town called Starr, with my wife, Amanda, and our two dogs, Argos and Bob. Harry Truman said many years ago that if you need a friend in politics, get a dog. And when you go into politics in any state, certainly especially in South Carolina, you're going to find that there are times when those who want to do the right thing are going to feel rather alone, because sadly that's an uncommon thing. You'll find plenty of people willing to pretend that they're wanting to do the right thing, but very few actually doing it. And as a result, activists, even legislators, will find themselves ostracized by the political class, by the establishment, and you might find it strange, here in a state like South Carolina, that should be a strong conservative state, that would happen here, but it does. Even though we have a Republican majority, Republican supermajority in the state House, which just got even stronger after the November election results came in. I think Republicans picked up 4 seats from Democrats. Even with all of that, we struggle to get conservative legislation passed. I think there are a few factors that are the reason for that. For one thing, I think plenty of South Carolinians have a sense of false security. The mentality might be that this is South Carolina and we're a conservative state, and bad things that you might see in New York and California, those couldn't happen here. But I'm here to tell you otherwise, that not only can they, but they have in some cases. So, I hate that this is the case, but we have to be just as vigilant, and sometimes we have to work even harder here because we're working against a situation where I guess it's going to feel like we're working against inertia. It's going to feel sometimes like we're trying to roll a bowling ball uphill. So that's not insurmountable. I'm not telling you that to discourage you by any means. I've been fighting that fight for the last 8 years in the legislature, and even actually for the 7 years before that. I got involved in politics as an activist in 2008, when Obama was elected, and was an organizer of the Anderson Tea Party organization, and went to Washington, lobbied against Obamacare, did all of that, and I've learned a lot through that whole entire process, and probably, I'm guessing many of you feel a bit compelled to get involved, a certain sense of responsibility that we have to try, and that's really what got me involved in politics. It wasn't out of personal ambition or even personal interest. Quite frankly, it was a sense of duty, a sense of responsibility. My family was raised with the mentality that you don't complain about what's going on. You try to do something about it. And so I hope that you'll join me in doing that in the days going forward. Tiffany asked me to talk about a few specific things, and I'm going to cover some of those things that she mentioned. I'm going to cover some additional things that I think you need to know. And then we'll just open it up for questions, and whatever questions you've got, we'll go over them. So to start out with, just kind of a high-level overview of how the legislative process works, and it's an opportune time to go over that right now, because we just finished the election cycle and the legislative cycle is about to start up. So in South Carolina, we have a 2-year legislative session, which means the legislature meets, after the election, the legislature will go into session, bills will get filed, debated, passed back and forth between the House and Senate, some sent to the governor, some will die. And then, that session will end in May of 2023. But that's the first year of the 2-year session. And the second year will start the following January. And any bills that didn't pass in 2023 will still be eligible to pass in 2024. So that's what we mean by a 2-year legislative session. There are some important things to know about the time frame. One of my political mentors drilled into my head that politics runs on time. And it's true. Politics does run on time. If you're going to get involved in politics, you have to do so according to a timeline that is dictated to you. You do not get to decide what that timeline is. You can, only you can decide how much you're going to do within that time frame. But the time frame is important to know and it's important to respect. Obviously, that doesn't mean that politicians run on time. You'll find that politicians are late all the time. But the legislative session is going to start it's the second Tuesday in January. It looks like that'll be January the 10th this year. And it will end the second Thursday in May, which, if I'm not mistaken, that should be May 11th of this coming year. So that's roughly 4.5 months. Now, during that time frame, the House and the Senate both meet on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, pretty much every week, from the second week in January to the second week in May. Now, there are some constraints and some things you need to know within that time frame. So the first thing that you need to know is that in the House, sometime, and the dates vary some, but sometime around mid-March, the House stops everything, drops everything, and takes up the state budget. And that's all that will happen that week. We call that budget week. And instead of meeting Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, the legislature will actually go into session on Monday and will remain in session until the budget is passed. However long that takes. It might get done Wednesday, might get done Thursday. It might go till the following Sunday. Who knows? Depends on how much controversy there is. So that's an important thing to know. So if you've got a bill you're trying to get through, it ain't happening that week. So you either get it done before that week or you get it done after that week, but your chances of getting it done after budget week diminish greatly, because usually the week following budget week is a spring furlough. And so it's actually a 2-week carve out in March where the House is not going to be debating whatever bills that you're working on. So the first of those 2 weeks is the budget. The second week is a spring break. And again, those dates are somewhat flexible. It may be the second and third week in March. It may be the first and second week in March. I don't know. Those dates will be announced by the House Budget Chairman and the Speaker as that time draws closer, probably sometime in February. All right. So the second issue with trying to pass a bill after that point is that there is a very important deadline coming up on April the 10th, and that is on a fixed date every single year, and it's called the crossover deadline. So any bills that get filed in the House have to pass first, second, third readings by April the 10th, or it's dead for the year. So, if it doesn't make the April the 10th deadline, it's going to sort of hang in limbo until the following year, at which time it may come up, pass, and go over to the Senate at that point. So that's, and there are some workarounds. That is a rule. That's a House rule. The Senate has a similar rule. that applies to Senate bills coming over to the State House. And there are exceptions to that. Basically, the House or the Senate would have to vote 2/3 vote to take up a bill that came over after April the 10th. So it gets a whole lot harder to pass a bill after the budget. So for all intents and purposes, for the State House, the schedule you've got to work with, generally speaking, is the second Tuesday in January until probably mid-March, whenever that budget deadline comes up. Again, it's not impossible to get something done after that point, but it gets exponentially harder because of deadlines and because of procrastination and because it becomes a whole lot harder to get time on the floor or time in a committee to discuss the bill. All right, so I've made mention of 3 readings, and you might be wondering what I'm talking about there. It's really pretty simple. Different states have different ways of doing things, but in South Carolina, when a bill is filed, that is considered first reading. The process for filing a bill is literally the legislator who is filing the bill takes a printed hard copy of the bill up to the desk while the legislature is in session and hands it to the clerk. And at that point, the clerk hands it to the Speaker of the House. The Speaker of the House takes a look at the bill, reads the title, and hands the bill to the House clerk, along with a assignment to which of the 6 standing committees the bill is going to be assigned to. You can see a list of those committees at scstatehouse.gov by clicking on committees under the heading House of Representatives. So the main ones are agriculture, education, judiciary, labor, commerce, industry, medical, military, public, municipal affairs, and regulations, and ways and means. So that may be more than 6. So most bills are going to get assigned to one of those committees. That's considered first reading. I should mention that you may hear something about pre-filed bills or a pre-filed bill deadline coming up, and there are some deadlines for pre-filing bills coming up in December. All that is doing is basically letting the world know that this bill is going to be filed on the first day of session, and the House clerk goes ahead and gives it a bill number early. That's literally all that happens. It gets published on the State House website early. And that may be a good thing for you, or that may be a bad thing for you. You have to evaluate, what the advantages or disadvantages are of that. If it's going to be a tough bill to pass, it's probably a good idea to give yourself as much runway as possible. If you've got a legislator willing to pre-file it, go ahead and do that and get the bill number assigned to it. And before the legislative session starts in January, go ahead and start, promoting the bill number and getting people to contact their legislators about that bill number. But that said, the bill isn't actually filed until the first day of session. So that's an important thing to know. All right, so that's first readings when the bill gets filed and gets assigned to a committee. There are no votes. That's just really just a formality. Second reading happens much later, and it's only going to happen for a bill if it makes it through the committee process, and I'll describe what that looks like here in a minute. But once a bill comes out of committee and comes to the House floor, it comes up for a debate and a vote. Once that is completed, once there's no one else wishing to speak on the bill, there are no further amendments to consider, then that bill will come up for second reading. And that is a vote. That is, by state law, a roll call vote, which means each legislator votes person by person, and it is recorded in the journal, which is, what we call the official minutes of the legislature. It's recorded person by person how each legislator voted on that bill. That's important because you need to know how your legislators are voting on stuff. Are they voting for good stuff and voting against bad stuff, or vice versa? You need to know that. All right, so that's second reading. That's a mandatory roll call. Third reading happens the next legislative day. So if it's a Tuesday, then if a bill passes second reading on Tuesday, then third reading will happen on Wednesday, usually. If it's on Wednesday, then third reading will be on Thursday. If the bill passes second reading on Thursday, if there is unanimous consent to do so, it can get third reading on Friday in what is known as a perfunctory session. Basically, the Speaker of the House and the clerk both show up in the State House chamber and have what's known as a perfunctory session, where basically he gives third reading to all the bills that are needing that, and then session is adjourned. There's nothing else that happens. There are no other members there. It's just a way to speed up the process. And again, that can only happen if there is unanimous consent to do so, which means any one legislator can object to that. I've been known to do that on many occasions. So, all right, so that's first, second, third reading. Third reading is not necessarily a roll call vote. There's no requirement for that to be. It may be a voice vote where the speaker says, all in favor say aye, all opposed nay, the ayes have it, that sort of thing. And it's, the outcome of the vote is recorded in the journal, but you wouldn't know person by person how each legislator voted at that point. Now, the exception there is if 10 members request a roll call, then that could become a roll call. That's important as well, because second reading is an automatic roll call, but there are plenty of important votes on, say, amendments, on motions that might kill a bill or fast track a bill. And any of those motions require 10 members to get a roll call vote on that. You want your legislators requesting that. And if it's your bill, or if it's a bill you're trying to stop, anytime an important vote is coming up, including an amendment vote or a procedural motion of some sort that will impact the bill, you need to be pushing legislators to request a roll call vote on that. The reason that's important is because, believe it or not, legislators act differently when they know everyone is watching. That includes Republicans, especially includes Republicans, because we have a bunch of Republicans in the State House that hold themselves out as conservatives, but at the end of the day, they don't really act all that conservative. But when you request a roll call vote, then that's a signal to them, oh, you're watching, people are watching, this is going to be recorded in the journal, everybody's going to see how I vote here. They're going to think twice about playing games with that vote. So it really helps us when it comes to freedom and liberty to get roll call votes as much as possible. All right, so those are the three readings. Let's back up for a minute and let's talk about the committee process. Now, in some states, every bill that gets filed gets a hearing in committees. Somewhere, some committee at some point in time during the session, every bill gets heard. That is not at all the case in South Carolina. In fact, most bills that get filed do not get hearings in committee, do not make it to the floor for second reading, and do not pass. There are no limits on how many bills can get filed in South Carolina. As a result, lots and lots and lots and lots of bills get filed. Hundreds, even thousands of bills every session get filed. So the committee process is kind of the winnowing process that is intended to weed out the bad bills. Many of the bills that are filed really and truly should die. They're crap. They should not pass. They really don't even need to get debated. We know that they're bad bills and they just need to die, period. So, in some sense, that is a real feature of the process. However, the other thing you need to know here about this that will sometimes work against you is that in South Carolina, committee chairmen, the chairman of each of those major committees that I mentioned a minute ago, have almost insurmountable say on what bills in their committee pass and which ones don't. When I say almost insurmountable say, I mean it takes a lot of pressure and outside effort to circumvent a committee chairman. If he or she does not want the bill to pass, then they can stop it from passing simply by not letting it come up in their committee. They have unilateral discretion over which bills go on the committee agenda and when committee meetings happen, what bills get discussed and for how long. All of that is entirely within the say of the one individual committee chairman. That's important to know. There are some workarounds. I'm fairly well known in South Carolina for being the lead sponsor for constitutional carry legislation, which is legislation to allow you to carry a legally owned concealable firearm for your personal protection without having to ask the state for permission. Right now, you can do that, but only after you have asked the state for permission in the form of a concealed weapons permit. So it's my view that that should be your choice. Well, believe it or not, and despite being a heavily Republican state with a Republican supermajority, that has been a bill where the committee chairman of the House Judiciary Committee and the Speaker of the House both have been opposed to that bill. And so they have blocked it. So I filed the bill year after year. I asked the chairman for a committee hearing on the bill. He would always say yes. I would ask when, and he would always say, I'll get back to you. You know, it was the checks in the mail, that kind of thing. And sure enough, he never would get around to actually scheduling the bill. So once I realized that he was stonewalling, then I began to look for workarounds. And one of those workarounds is every legislative day, there is a point in the legislative agenda known as the motion period. And any member can get up and make any motion during the motion period, and it only requires a simple majority to pass. And so there were a couple of instances in 2017, I think again in 2019, where I was able to go into the motion period and force a roll call vote on pulling the constitutional carry bill out of committee. Sadly, that didn't pass those times, but it helped set the stage for what would happen later. And, you know, that story is still playing itself out even as we speak. So it's not insurmountable, but just know it is difficult, and it will take a lot of planning, a lot of investment, and a lot of work to circumvent a committee chairman who blocks your bill. On the other hand, if you've got a bad bill and you can get the committee chairman to block that bad bill, then that's a really good thing. And, you know, that can go a long way towards stopping that bill dead in its tracks. You know, but by the same token, the other side can do what I just described and go and, you know, and find a workaround and, you know, go around that, that individual. All right, so let's say that you've got a bill, it gets assigned to a committee. Then that committee chairman organizes his or her committee into subcommittees. These subcommittees are usually organized by topic, or, you know, basically by subject matter. And as I've said before, they may or may not assign your bill to one of those subcommittees. If they do assign it to a subcommittee, then that subcommittee meeting will be posted according to the state Freedom of Information law. They have to do so 24 hours in advance, and they do that on the state legislative website, sestatehouse.gov. You will see upcoming committee hearings listed under House meeting schedule or Senate meeting schedule. It will include an agenda. It will tell you when and where to be. In some cases, you'll be able to watch a live stream, although that's not always a guarantee. Not all committee meetings are live streamed. Now, when a bill is assigned to subcommittee in the House, that is an opportunity for a public hearing, for public testimony to be offered or taken. So if you like a bill or don't like a bill and you want to speak for or against it, that is your opportunity to participate directly in the process in that way if you want to. So, and that's also something to be aware of, that if it's your bill that's going in subcommittee, it's quite likely that your opposition will show up to that meeting and speak against the bill. So you need to be aware that that's going to happen and determine how you're going to address it. All right. Then once the bill does come up in subcommittee, there's no guarantee that they're going to actually vote. If you're trying to pass your bill through that committee, then you certainly want to be mindful of the time frame that the committee is meeting, because some of these meetings are time limited. You don't want to use up all the time talking about how great your bill is and prevent the committee from voting on your bill. So you got to keep an eye on the clock and avoid repetitious testimony and things like that. But assuming the committee votes, there are 3 actions that they can usually take. They can recommend the bill pass. So generally, when we say a bill passes subcommittee, what we're really saying is the subcommittee likes it and recommended that the full committee passes. So they make that motion and they take a vote on it. Or they can take a vote on recommending that the bill not pass the full committee. So they can still vote to advance the bill to full committee, but it's with an unfavorable recommendation, which the full committee may or may not agree with. So a subcommittee can vote that a bill should not pass, and then the full committee overturn that and say, we're going to pass it anyway, and send it on its way to the House floor. So if you want a bill to die, if you want a bad bill to die, that's not the way to do it. The way to do it is the third thing that a subcommittee can do, and that is to take no action at all, to adjourn the meeting without voting, or to make a motion to adjourn debate on the bill, which is basically saying we're going to postpone any further discussion of this bill to a future meeting, which is not determined. And then more often than not, that in and of itself will kill the bill, but you may have to be prepared to come back and fight it again in a subsequent meeting. So that's the committee process. Once it goes through subcommittee, then it goes up to full committee. That full committee can debate it, amend it, vote on it. If they vote to pass it with or without an amendment, then it goes to the House floor. Now, how do you know what bills are coming up on the House floor? Well, the official legislative agenda is known as the calendar. Don't confuse this with the House meeting schedule. The House meeting schedule and the House calendar are 2 completely different things. The House meeting schedule is a schedule of committee hearings and things like that are coming up, including when the House itself is meeting. The House calendar, however, is simply the official legislative agenda listing all the bills that the House is prepared to debate and possibly address in the upcoming legislative day. Once again, you can find that on the state legislative website. And if you want to follow along with what's happening in your state legislature, that's the place to go to see what bills might come up. Now, just because it's on the calendar doesn't mean that the House will address it that day. Even if it says it's scheduled for such and such a day, there are many motions and different things that can be done to skip over that bill and move on to the next one, or to postpone it to a future date or something like that. And those things often do happen. So just be aware that it's not a guarantee. I have seen bills come to the House floor and then sit there unaddressed for months. Legislators continually just sort of hold it in limbo by making a motion to adjourn debate every time the bill comes up on the House floor. So that's a tactic. That's also a tactic for killing the bill, because, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have these deadlines. And so basically that means every bill that gets filed dies just a tiny little bit every single legislative day. So the next day it's a little bit more dead. And the day after that, it's a little bit more dead still. And when you get near the end of the legislative session, they're almost all the way dead. So stalling tactics by legislators, or by you if you're trying to stop a bad bill, can be used to prevent bills from passing. All right, now everything I just described that happens in the House, once a bill makes it through all 3 readings and goes over to the Senate, let's say it happens even before April the 10th crossover deadline, at that point, it goes through an entire process all over again on the Senate side. So the president of the Senate assigns the bill to committee on first reading. It goes to that committee chairman, who may or may not assign it to a subcommittee, who may or may not have a subcommittee hearing with a public, with an opportunity for public testimony on the Senate side. And then, those committees may vote it out to the Senate floor, and the Senate may choose to, vote on the bill and pass it. Now, there are some important things to be aware of, some procedural hurdles in the Senate, which frequently make it very difficult to, for House bills to pass. So even though most House bills that get filed die, most House bills that make it out of the House die in the Senate. And, that's from a variety of factors, but one thing you should know is that any one senator can stop a bill dead on its tracks on the Senate floor by placing an objection on it. Once a senator places an objection on it, it becomes much, much more difficult to pass that bill. The only way to overcome that objection, if they're not willing to remove their objection, is to put the bill on what is known as special order, which takes either a majority of the Senate Rules Committee, which is generally controlled by the Senate Majority Leader, or by I believe it's a 2/3 vote of the entire Senate. We do not have a Republican 2/3 in the Senate. We definitely do not have a conservative 2/3 in the Senate. So that has been a hurdle in the past on good conservative legislation. Even if you clear that hurdle, then the second hurdle that you face is there are no time limits in the Senate. Everything in the House is time limited, so it's not actually really all that possible for someone to filibuster in the House. But in the Senate, once you're recognized and you take the well and you start speaking, there's no limit, and you can go as long as you can. You can go and go and go and go and go, and you can kill a bill by talking it to death, literally. There have been legislators that have done that. How do you deal with that obstruction? Well, the Senate has a move that they can do called cloture, and that is basically they're voting to make the person sit down and shut up, and you move on to a vote. A cloture motion requires, I believe, a 3/5 vote of the Senate, so it's greater than a majority. We are just barely at that threshold where we do have 3/5 majority of Republicans in the state Senate, but we do not have a 3/5 majority of conservatives in the state Senate. So that too has been a hurdle that we've had to face. So those are some of the idiosyncrasies that you need to be aware of, and some of the pitfalls and traps, I guess, when it comes to bills working their way through the legislative process here in South Carolina. This is true in every other state that I know of, but once bills get passed in the House and Senate, they go to the governor to be signed. The governor can veto. Once the governor vetoes, then the House and Senate can override that veto with the 2/3 vote. That frequently does happen on budget votes, but occasionally it will happen on other bills as well. Any questions on that before I move on to the next topic here? And you're all muted, so if you are speaking, you'll need to unmute yourself. Okay, well, I
have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
Are you going to address how come we don't have closed primaries and what you think we can do to get that to happen?
Mhm. Yes, I'll be glad to address that, and I'm going to address several other um, issues that stand in the way of liberty and freedom in South Carolina. So that was actually that's a good segue into the next set of topics that I wanted to bring up with you guys. Um, so we have a long history in South Carolina. South Carolina is one of the oldest states. It was the Carolinas back then. It was jointly North and South Carolina together before this two states split. Carolina was one of the original 13 colonies. And South Carolina has had 5 constitutions over its history. The most recent constitution was created and ratified in 1895 by none other than Jim Crow. Well, a Jim Crow type, I should say. It was definitely the Jim Crow era. It was a man by the name of Pitchfork Ben Tillman. That was his nickname, Pitchfork Ben. And he was definitely a thug. And it was a period in time in the state's history where those in power in South Carolina were very, very concerned about getting a Black governor. And so they arranged things in the Constitution and passed a Constitution that basically stripped the governor of almost all power, to the point that the governor is almost he's little more than just a figurehead. So, as a result, what that did is that represented a huge power grab by the legislature away from the executive branch. From studying the Constitution and your civics classes and whatever, that power in America is divided between 3 branches of government. The executive branch is the governor that carries out the law, and the attorney general and everyone else there in that branch. Your state agencies, your cabinet agencies. Then you have the legislature that makes the law, that governs everything that the executive is supposed to carry out, and you have the judiciary that settles disputes regarding the law. Now, in 1895, the South Carolina legislature grabbed away huge swaths of power from the other 2 branches of government and made the legislature extremely and inordinately more powerful than it should be, and more powerful than it is in other states. So that's important, because when it comes to registration by party, closed primaries, medical freedom, blocking vaccine mandates, all the way down to what are the policies that run your schools, and why aren't the roads getting fixed, and so many other things that plague South Carolina right now. The buck stops with the legislature. Hear me loud and clear on that. The buck stops with the legislature, House and Senate both. So the governor tends to get a lot of attention, but as it was in 1895 and still is to this day, the governor still does not have direct control over the majority of state agencies in South Carolina. There are a few cabinet agencies that he has direct control over, but many of them are governed by a board, which is appointed in many cases by the legislature. So that's an important thing to know. So there are all these boards and commissions that pretty much run South Carolina behind the scenes. It's not the governor doing it, and it's not directly the legislature, although the legislature has the power to do something about that. So that's a huge step away from transparent government. It's a huge step away from accountable government, and it's a big reason why you have problems with DHEC. It's a big reason we have problems with the Election Commission. It's a big reason why we have problems with the Department of Transportation. All 3 of those are involved with issues that I guarantee everyone on this call care very deeply about. So, this was identified several years ago by the South Carolina Policy Council as a barrier to freedom. I'm going to post a link to their article here in the chat on this call, and you can pull it up there and maybe Tiffany, maybe you can email it out after this to everyone that you invited to be on the call. But they identified 8 specific reforms that South Carolina needs. They published this piece years ago, probably about 10 years ago now, in fact. And sadly, very little progress has been made on any of these. On a few of these, the legislature has pretended to take some action on, but the action they took was not actually meaningful or substantial. So these are still very much outstanding issues. Now, part of what that means with the legislature dominating things in South Carolina is that the legislature has then taken the opportunity to tip the scales even more in their favor. So, for instance, the legislature has the power to suspend any state law for a year within the budget. You can pass the legislature can pass what is known as a budget proviso, and they can suspend any state law for that year, for that fiscal year. By the way, the fiscal year in South Carolina goes from July 1st to June 30th. In addition to that, in the state's Freedom of Information Act law, there's an explicit provision exempting legislators from being subject to that law. Now, legislative meetings are not exempt, but the legislators themselves are exempt. So you can't send a FOIA request to a state legislator asking for, I don't know, all of their emails or a log of all of their phone calls or calls that have come to their office or anything like that. Things you might have been able to do in other states, you can't do it if it involves a legislator. The other thing to know about the FOIA law and legislators is that when a person sends a Freedom of Information Act request to a government official or an agency other than a legislator, they can be charged money for the time, for the cost of reproduction, materials, whatever. And those may or may not be reasonable fees. If it's information they don't want you to have, then they may try to make it an insurmountable price. They may charge you something ridiculous like $5,000 for this information. However, if that same FOIA request is made by a legislator, they cannot charge any fees to that legislator as long as the FOIA request has to do with their official legislative duties. So, as a constituent service, while I was in office, I made it known that anytime someone had that happen, if they needed a FOIA request made and were getting blocked with unreasonable fees or whatever, send me the FOIA request. I will file it for you, and they can't charge me. Obviously, I'm no longer a legislator, so I can't do that. But I'm telling you, perhaps you can approach a legislator about that if that ever becomes a need. So the other thing I want to talk about here is within the legislature itself. In the state house, which is what I'm most familiar with because I served in it, it tends to be a top-down power structure. And it starts with the Speaker of the House. The Speaker of the House decides which committees each legislator sits on, and indirectly controls who the committee chairmen are on each committee. So, if the Speaker wants something or doesn't want something, as a legislator, normally you're going to think twice about going against the Speaker, because if you go against the Speaker, he can kill all of your bills. He can take you off of all committees and do probably other bad things to you. So that's something that, legislators tend to be kind of afraid of. I didn't care. I didn't care about making the Speaker mad, and I made him very, very mad on many occasions. So, I hope that you'll find a good legislator to work with on your issue that likewise doesn't care about making the Speaker mad when it comes to liberty and freedom. But just know that it does tend to be a top-down power structure, and that's a historical thing as well in South Carolina. Going back decades. You may hear South Carolinians talk about the good old boy network and how the good old boy network runs the state. Well, what I've just described for you is the good old boy network. Okay. Starts with the Speaker of the House. It goes down through his committee chairman, goes down through his subcommittee chairman. And then there's this thing called a caucus. You might have heard of this and wondering what that is. Well, there in the state house and the state senate, there are 3 recognized caucuses. A caucus is simply a group of legislators, a group of elected legislators. The 3 caucuses are the House and Senate Republican caucuses, the House and Senate Democrat caucuses, and the House and Senate, I kid you not, legislative black caucuses. So, those are the 3 recognized caucuses. Obviously, you can be, part of more than one of those. You could be a part of the Republican caucus and the black caucus, or, Democrat caucus and black caucus, and so forth. Those are just groups. There's nothing particularly special about them. However, they tend to get a lot of money from special interests, and they tend to spend a lot of money come election time defending the legislators that they like, which means people that are not like me, people that do what the Speaker of the House tells them to do, and so forth. So whatever, people who are going to march to the drum beat of the party establishment, those are going to be the people that the party caucus throws their weight around, their money around, to help defend from challengers in the primary, to help defend, against the other party in the general election as well. Legislators tend to think these caucuses are pretty special. I think that the fact that I got kicked out of the House Republican caucus is actually pretty special. But at the end of the day, it really just comes down to, it's yet another tool for that good old boy network to exert their power and influence on the people's representatives and the people's senators. It's an unfortunate reality. You need to know that it exists and why it exists, and where the hidden opposition is coming from sometimes when you may not know where certain things are coming from. All right. So all of those give sort of the backdrop and the conditions on why we don't have things like registration by party. Some of our neighbor states do. North Carolina, for instance, has registration by party. South Carolina does not. Which basically means that you don't have to pick a party affiliation when you register to vote, and you can, every election year, you get to decide whether you vote in the Republican primary or the Democrat primary, or neither. And just because you vote in one or the other does not mean that you are bound to do so come November. You're not bound to vote for that candidate. So basically that means we have plenty of Democrats that vote in Republican primaries. We may have Republicans voting in Democrat primaries, and so forth. I do believe that is a factor in why people like Lindsey Graham, Senator Lindsey Graham, keep getting reelected in South Carolina. He is a scumbag. He is awful. He is not a conservative. He is not even really a Republican, in my opinion. But he keeps getting reelected as a Republican and serving in Washington, D.C., where he's been for many decades. And, he's a very shrewd operator. There's, I'll give him some credit. Part of the reason is him. He knows what he's doing, and he's very, very good at it. But on the other hand, I do have to ask, if it were just Republicans voting in the primary for U.S. Senate, could he get reelected? And I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. Now, another aspect or tentacle of this good old boy network in South Carolina has to do with the state major parties. So the South Carolina Republican Party and the South Carolina Democrat Party. The South Carolina, both of those parties really aren't about their party platform. They have published party platforms where they take specific positions on issues, and one of the Republican platform issues is registration by party. It's also constitutional carry. It's also ending abortion and a number of other things that we haven't done. So, really what the leadership of the South Carolina Republican Party has been about historically in the last 10 to 15 years that I've been involved here, is not about advancing ideas, it's about advancing politicians. And in particular, those politicians who are willing to be loyal to what the chairman of the South Carolina Republican Party wants. So much like the Speaker of the House, much like the majority leader, who is the head of the Republican caucus, you've got the state GOP chairman. Those three all kind of work together. They do each other's bidding. They do favors for each other. That's how the Good Old Boy Network operates here in South Carolina. That's where you find it right there. So to the extent that you're willing to go in and help us retake the reins of the South Carolina GOP away from these people, and by the way, it is Lindsey Graham loyalists that pretty much run the SCGOP. It's literally his staff, his campaign staff, that are primarily responsible for the inner workings of the South Carolina Republican Party. So, every couple of years there's a reorganization. You can get involved at the precinct level and work your way up, all the way up to the state level, and be directly involved with the running of the Republican Party if you want to do that. Several counties have, and we've made some progress, but there's lots more work that needs to be done. All that to say, when you've got state party officials who see it as their main job to protect the incumbent legislators like Lindsey Graham, who probably benefit from the fact that we do not have registration by party or closed primaries, then you can start to see why, the Republican establishment that should be pushing this through is actually responsible for blocking it from happening. And that's going to continue to happen until the Republican rank and file throughout our state demand otherwise. And when I say demand otherwise, I mean to the point that those people, the chairman of the GOP, the Speaker of the House, et cetera, until they start worrying that they're going to lose their position and lose their power if they don't get on board with passing your bill, until that happens, they're not going to see you as a threat. And until that happens, nothing's going to really change. So they can see you as a threat, but what that requires is that you find people like yourselves, get educated on how this process works, and go and organize. Doesn't take a majority. It only takes a tiny minority. I think it was Sam Adams that said it doesn't take a majority to prevail. Rather, it takes a tireless minority keen on setting brush fires in the minds of men. The Revolutionary War was fought and won against King George, the greatest military power of the time, by just 3% of the colony's population. And generally speaking, most elections are decided by just 3% of the population. So you don't have to go out and find a majority of people that agree with you. You just have to go out and find some. And it may be as little as a few dozen, or it may be as little as a few hundred. But if you go and you do that consistently, then I guarantee you the legislators in your area will start getting worried. And when they get worried, the Good Old Boy Network bosses above them will also get worried. So that's how real change will come to South Carolina. It requires us to organize. It's certainly a factor in my decisions and my actions over the past 8+ years. I started out as an activist. I didn't stop being an activist once I became a legislator. And now that I'm no longer a legislator, I'm still an activist. So that's why I'm here speaking to you, and I'm glad to do so. And I hope that you'll go and help me do this. It's not enough to send good people into office. It's not enough. And everything I just described should hopefully illustrate why that's true. You send good people into office, and they're going to be blocked, stonewalled, stymied, kicked out of the caucus, have their bills blocked, have candidates run against them, and have the party and the caucus fund their opposition. until either they're so demoralized that they're no longer trying to do the right thing, or they're removed from office. And that sounds horrible and that sounds cruel, and it is, but we can defeat that. But we just have to decide that we're going to, and then go and do it, and be committed to the process. Be committed to the time that it's going to take. It's going to take, a few election cycles. One thing I'm really encouraged about in this last election is that we out and out defeated 3 or maybe 4 of the diehard opponents of liberty and freedom in the South Carolina House. They were all Republicans. On top of that, several Democrats were defeated by Republicans as well. So, I mean, there are huge opportunities for advancing liberty and freedom in the upcoming legislative session, but don't think that it's just going to happen organically, because it's not. Or movements don't create themselves. Someone has to go out and organize it. Good people aren't going to stay good just because you sent them there. They're only going to stay good when you make them stay good, because that's the price of them going back into office. And on that note, I'll conclude by recalling a statement from Senator Everett Dirksen, who was I believe, a Democrat U.S. Senator during the civil rights movement in the 60s and 70s. And he famously said, "When I feel the heat, then I see the light." That's true. It's not just true of Senator Dirksen, it's true of every legislator. And that's true in every state, including South Carolina. So the thing that we have at our advantage is we have a higher percentage of the population here that is conservative, that does agree with us on conservative policy issues, and will get involved if we go to them and ask them to, and show them how, and give them specific ways and opportunities to do that. So, this is fertile ground. It's much easier to do this than it would be in Colorado or New York or California, Maryland, or even Michigan. So I'm glad to be here. I'm glad you're here, and I hope you'll help us become a huge threat to the Good Old Boy Network and make the people's government work for the people once again. So that's really kind of a high-level overview of how the legislative process works in South Carolina, what the obstacles are to liberty and freedom. There's much more that could be said about this, but I want to open it up for questions now. So you can either put a question in the group chat on this call, or you can unmute yourself and just ask a question. I'll be glad to try to address it.
Hi, Jonathan. I'm going to just jump in here and start. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this, and for Tiffany to set it up. A question I have, we talk a lot about pushing bills. In my review, I know that school's a big issue. It's a big topic here, education. Myself and someone else, we went through the education laws. I'm not a big fan of these laws that have been implemented in South Carolina via Title 59. It's a massive, giant section of really bad laws that have ruined education in the state and allowed for what's happening, the indoctrination going on in our schools. Now, we talk a lot about pushing bills. What about repealing? I mean, I've certainly created a list of laws that I would love to repeal, but that's very difficult, I'm assuming, in this state. So can you speak on going about just introducing that idea to repeal certain laws? Thank you. Sure.
And thank you for that, Michelle. So you're absolutely right. Actually, the education agencies are the worst example that exists in South Carolina in terms of lack of accountability and a diffusion of responsibility. So basically, if you ask, well, who's responsible for books and libraries? Who's responsible for the policies that those people have to follow? Who's responsible for the funding? Who's responsible for, classroom size? And any number of other things that affect our schools. Who's responsible for, either implementing or stopping, CRT from being taught in schools? And the question and the answer is going to be unclear because of how convoluted the education bureaucracy is in South Carolina. It's, as far as I know, worse than any other state that I know of. We have the state superintendent of education, which in many states would be an appointed position under the governor, but in this case, it's an elected position, a statewide election. And then you have, and that person is over the State Department of Education. We saw a glaring example of how that can be a bad thing when you have the governor a couple of years ago wanting to reopen schools and the superintendent of education holding a press conference right after his saying, no, we're not going to reopen schools. And they're at this doing, here's the governor trying to set the policy for the state, but here's the education superintendent setting a different policy. So that happens. In addition to that, you have the State Board of Education. The State Board of Education is appointed by, you guessed it, the legislature. And good luck trying to figure out which legislators, because the way the State Board of Education works is it's one person, not per county, not per legislative district, not even per congressional district. It's one person per judicial circuit in South Carolina. And those do not correspond to any other lines. So you've got to go and figure out which legislators are in each of those judicial circuits to find out which legislators are responsible for each board position on the state board. Well, the State Board of Education is responsible for the state standards, which has a lot to do with the curriculum that gets taught in South Carolina. So it's the legislators via the State Board of Education that's responsible for that. Then it gets worse. There is the Education Oversight Committee, because, we don't trust the state superintendent or the Board of Education to do their job. So now we're going to add yet another committee to oversee all of this. The Education Oversight Committee has been involved with deciding on making decisions on, assessments, what standardized tests get taken or procured for the state, standards for teachers, et cetera. The incoming state superintendent of education is the former chairman of the Education Oversight Committee. And then, as if that weren't bad enough, both the House and the Senate have standing oversight committees of their own, which every few years reviews what the education branch of government is doing. So, you've got still a lot of control and a lot of involvement of legislators, but also the legislators themselves are responsible for a system where the responsibilities aren't totally clear. There can be contradiction, and a lot of finger pointing back and forth. All of that originates in state law, and yes, the legislators are responsible for that, and yes, the law is antiquated. And I'll give you just another practical example. Is we don't fund students in South Carolina, we fund programs. That's an important distinction. It shouldn't be that way. Funding students would be a much better way to go about it. But in the process of funding programs in South Carolina, there are 3 separate laws that were passed that were funding laws. So you've got 3 primary streams of money coming into the education system, and they all have specific strings that the state has put on those. And so imagine the nightmare of trying to run a school district and getting all this funding, and these dollars I can use for these things, and these dollars I can use for these things, and these other dollars I can use for something else, and these federal dollars I can use for these things over here. It's very convoluted. It's very complicated. And when it comes to practical things like, I don't know, bringing back band into a school, or having a class on cursive, or teaching speech and debate or logic, or any of the other things that seem to have been relegated to oblivion in our state schools. Good luck finding the funding for those things. I don't know where you find it. So even establishment legislators that aren't especially conservative on other things recognize the problems with our state education funding laws and the fact that it has become bloated, unwieldy, too complicated, and just really just hard to deal with. But ultimately, until somebody has the guts to do something audacious and ambitious, it's not going to change. All the years that I was in the State House, I had in my office here now, I have hanging on my wall 44 laws of the public policy process. I highly recommend you get a copy of this and read them. They're by Morton Blackwell, 44 laws of the public policy process. I'll put it in the chat here. Public policy process by Morton Blackwell. Morton Blackwell created the Leadership Institute in Virginia to train conservative activists and conservative candidates and legislators on various aspects of how government works and how the process works. And one of his laws says that it is the extremes that define the middle. So if you want to change something, you do it from the extreme. You don't do it by saying, here's a bill that's going to make things just a tiny little bit better. That's not going to actually change anything. That's going to get shot down. Or if it does pass, it's not going to make a significant difference. The things that make that drive huge changes in politics are the people out on the edges. It's the AOCs, it's the Thomas Masseys, it's those people on the outside edges that everyone loves to hate on, that are really moving policy either to the right or to the left. So bear in mind, yes, I hope someone will file a bill to do away with a huge swath of laws, or take on the job of revamping school funding in South Carolina in a way that encourages school choice rather than bureaucracy and state-run programs. So that was a little long-winded, but hopefully that answers your question and builds out on some other points that I hadn't had a chance to make yet.
It did. Thank you.
I have 2 questions.
Okay.
One, I don't know if you'll know it, but I'm just curious, maybe you will. Do you know who decides what vaccines go into the schedule, if it's DHEC or if it's the legislators here?
That is, well, the answer to every political question is it depends. The legislature certainly can and has passed legislation in the past requiring certain vaccines to be offered. One notable example within the last 10 years was a bill originally started out as a bill to mandate HPV vaccines for every teenage girl in school. As it went through the process, that proved to be too controversial, and they watered it down to the point where DHEC is required to offer to every young girl in school the HPV vaccine. I don't even like that, and I opposed that bill all the way, but that is an example of the legislature by state law injecting themselves into that process. But if there's not anything that the law has directly, if a bill hasn't been passed on it specifically, then it's totally up to DHEC at that point. Now, let's talk about regulations for a minute, because it does come back to the legislature. So we have the state constitution, which is the highest law of the state. Then we have the state laws, which the legislature passes, and it only takes a majority in the House and Senate and the governor's signature to pass any law. And then you have an even larger body of what is effectively law, known as the South Carolina Code of Regulations. You can also access that on the state legislative website, sestatehouse.gov. Each state agency is responsible for proposing and passing, what the term for that is promulgating regulations according to what the law requires them to do. So the way DHEC carries out a state mandated responsibility, state mandated meaning we've passed a law saying that they have to do this. The way they go about it is they draft a regulation implementing that law. And then they put that out for public review and public comment. And then they come back and the DHEC board votes on it and either enacts it or modifies it or whatever. When they have enacted a regulation, then that regulation, that starts a clock, a ticking clock. And that is a clock for legislative review. So there is a limited window where the legislature can interject themselves into the process and say, stop, hold everything. There's something in here we don't really like. We want you to go back and change this. There is a dedicated House Regulations Committee. There's not a dedicated Senate Regulations Committee. It's divvied up among any of the standing committees based on subject matter. But in the House, any DHEC regulation that gets proposed has the opportunity to come up and be reviewed by the House Regulations Committee. The House Regulations Committee can then, take action and require DHEC to go back to the drawing board and change certain things. We were able to do that last year with some anti-midwifery regulations they tried to push through. We only have 45 midwives in all of South Carolina, and they were trying to put those 45 out of business. And fortunately, I and my state senator in the Senate, Senator Richard Cash, were able to stop that. But if the legislature takes no action, then those regulations will go into effect and they will remain in effect. And here's something that has tripped people up in the past by not understanding how this works. The legislature cannot pass a regulation. The legislature can only pass a law. And that means the legislature cannot overturn or change a regulation, except for that review process that I just described. What the legislature can do is pass a law that contradicts a regulation and requires that state agency to go and redraw their regulations to comply with the new law. So that's just a detail that if you're going to work on medical freedom legislation that involves, has the aim of forcing DHEC to change the regulations, that's going to be how you're going to have to do it. But you should also keep a close eye on the regulations that they're proposing, because I guarantee you they will be back. They'll be back with more bad midwife regulations. They'll probably be back with other bad regulations as well. You'll catch those on DHEC's website. You'll also catch those on the website for the House and Senate. Oh, I'm sorry, for the House Regulations Committee. The House Regulations Committee, that committee on the State House webpage has a detailed list of all of the regulations that they're in the process of reviewing. So that's certainly something to keep an eye on as well.
Hey, Jonathan.
Yes.
This is Jordan Pace.
Hey, Jordan.
Hopped on a little while ago.
Congratulations, by the way.
for
Jordan is
doing this
one
for
of the new guys we're very excited about.
Well, I'm just pulled back into Somerville from freshman orientation, but that was
Okay.
a lot all at once. But just wanted to suggest maybe touching on what interest groups or drive those regulations, and the laws themselves that are pushed. Especially folks who are new to the state might not know about. I call it the power rankings of the interest groups. It used to be the utilities were the top dogs until the whole nuclear disaster a few years ago, and hospital association, those groups like that do things for their own self-interest.
Yeah, you're bringing up a good point. So I served on the House Medical Committee, Medical, Military, Municipal, and Public Affairs Committee. We called it 3M for short. And anytime a bill was coming up, almost without fail in subcommittee, some person with the representing the South Carolina Medical Association or the South Carolina Hospital Association would speak either for or against the bill. In addition to that, those organizations and other industry organizations in different industries. Like Jordan mentioned, there are various power utility associations, there are conservation associations dealing with land use and things like that, environmental issues, a number of special interest 501c3s and 501c4s out there in South Carolina tied to big business in various industries. And not only do they show up speaking for and against legislation in committee, they also take the committee members out to dinner on a regular basis. And it ain't McDonald's dinner. It's like a really posh, nice dinner. Now, it's illegal in South Carolina for a lobbyist to even so much as buy a legislator a cup of coffee. However, the lobbyist's employer can take a lobbyist out for dinner, can take a legislator out for dinner, as long as it's not a single legislator. They can take a caucus out, they can take a committee out, or they can take the whole House out, or the whole Senate out. So they can't, play favorites with particular legislators. That hasn't stopped them. There have been people like Labor, Commerce, and Industry Chairman in the House, Bill Sandifer, was well known and seen multiple times being wined and dined both in and out of Columbia by lobbyists directly. It's like they have no shame. They know they're breaking the law, but they don't care because they think they're above the law. So, that stuff happens. And if you do see that happening, you should definitely call foul on that.
And the only way, and as somebody who's working on the activist side too, the only way most of the legislators are going to do anything about it is if they get called on it by the constituents. The only organization that can hold a legislator accountable is the House or Senate Ethics Committee for doing stuff like that. So it's going to take pressure from the outside to do anything.
Since you mentioned that, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that one of the South Carolina Policy Council's things that they identified as in terms of reforms that are needed, to knock down barriers to freedom in South Carolina, is ending the ability for the lawmakers to police themselves. That's actually reform number 5. And they say, unlike other office holders, House and Senate members police their own ethics violations, and much of that process is kept completely private and secret and behind closed doors. There's no reason why lawmakers shouldn't be accountable to the same ethics laws that govern every other elected official. For instance, if you're running a 501c3 and you get a bunch of donor money for the purpose of, buying underprivileged kids Christmas presents for Christmas, and then you go and you take $50,000 of that money and you buy yourself a new car, that's criminal embezzlement. However, if you, as a legislator, raise a bunch of money for your campaign, and then you go and you spend, $3,000 on a cruise with your wife. I use an example like that because there are politicians who have done that exact thing, gone on vacation, bought fancy dresses, bought huge flat screen TVs, kid you not, bought sex toys and pornography out of their campaign funds, stuff like this. What should be considered criminal embezzlement is actually not. It's considered a different thing that you almost can't even really say is even a crime. It's an ethics violation, and it all falls under the Ethics Act. And you have the House and Senate ethics committees that deal with anything pertaining to any member of the House or the Senate or any candidate for House or Senate. And those committees are made up of fellow lawmakers. And you've got those guys being the judge, the jury, and the executioner, deciding what the law means, what the relevant facts of the case are, and what the punishment should be. You can imagine all the ways that can possibly go wrong and has gone wrong. If you're interested in delving into that, a good source is thenerve.org, as well as the state newspaper and the Post and Courier. All have had investigative journalists covering the ethics misdeeds and the crooked behavior of lawmakers. One of the reforms the Policy Council identified years ago was the need for lawmakers to fully disclose all of their income. There were some changes to income reporting requirements, but they made sure that there were enough loopholes to ensure that legislators still have the ability to hide who they're making their money from and how much, if they need to. So, you know, we still have a long way to go in terms of transparency and accountability in South Carolina, and nowhere is that more lacking than it is in the legislature itself.
There is a couple of questions in the chat.
Okay, you want to pick one? I've been busy talking.
No, no worries. I'm scrolling back and seeing because I know that there was a couple.
I do see one here. Jonathan, can you please explain how and what executive committeemen or precinct presidents can do to help make changes? That's a good question. So within your local Republican Party structure, you know, county executive committeemen, precinct presidents, and so forth. You know, what can you do to help with change? Well, one thing you can do is make sure that your legislators in your county know where you stand on the issues that are important to you. And on top of that, not just you, but bring as many people along with you as possible. So one good way to signal the party's position on something would be to pass a resolution calling on your county delegation to get on board and, you know, file or co-sponsor legislation dealing with something like, for instance, registration by party or closing the primaries, or whatever the issue is that you care about. So I do know that Palmetto Gun Rights is looking for interested individuals in county at the county party level to pass resolutions in support of constitutional carry, to help put pressure on the legislators in that county to get on board with that. So if you're interested, let me know. I'll connect you to the right person over there. So that's just one idea. Another idea is, you know, canvass your area. If you're a precinct president, you need to know who the conservatives are in your precinct. A precinct isn't all that huge. I mean, you're probably talking at the most a few hundred or 1,000 voters, registered voters. So make it a project over the course of the next year to go and visit every one of them, take them a survey, find out what they care about, find out if they're conservative or liberal. If you're liberal, cross them off the list. You know, and if they're conservative, maybe they want to work with you on pushing a particular issue. If you've got a bad legislator that represents you, maybe one of those people will be interested in running against that individual, you know, in the next election. So when I say we need to go out and organize, it's stuff like that. It's not glamorous. It's hard work. It takes time, takes some sweat equity, but you know, the people who do that will become feared by the politicians. There was a few years ago, there was a situation where a electric co-op in rural South Carolina was living the high life. They had set it up to where they were paid per board meeting, and they had an extraordinary number of board meetings just so that they could cut themselves more checks. And they kept running up power rates to pay for all this. And the people got tired of paying high power rates and figured out what was going on. And at the next election for co-op board, which nobody ever attends, like literally nobody pays attention to that stuff. There were 3,000 people from like 3 different counties that converged, literally took everything over, kicked those people out. And what was so interesting to me was that the first thing that happened were the local legislators from those areas made darn sure that they got in front of those crowds of people and said, "We're with you guys." You could tell that they were scared to death by this huge crowd of people that were against corruption in their local electric co-op. And I guarantee you some of those legislators were probably involved or complicit in some way in that corruption, but they were scared to death because a crowd that size could easily throw them out of office. So numbers do matter. Politics is not an ideas game. I wish it were. In reality, politics is a numbers game because legislators want to get reelected, and that is just about the only thing that will motivate them to action.
Can you just quickly break down fast what precincts are? Because I know New Yorkers, we're used to hearing precinct and we think like our like where the cops are, like our police.
Yes. Good point. The way our state Republican Party is organized is there is a convention and an executive committee, and each of those bodies have are populated with people that are elected at the local level. Each county party also has an executive committee and a convention, and they meet every so often, and the people that populate the local convention and the local executive committee are chosen at the local level. And the local level, when we talk about precincts, we're literally talking about voting precincts. So, each county is made up of, dozens, in larger counties, it may even be over 100 individual voting precincts. So the purpose of a voting precinct is supposed to be to locate a polling place that is convenient to that community, to encourage people to go and vote, and hopefully minimize problems and potential fraud and things like that. That's how it's supposed to work. Not saying that's how it does work, but the party makes use of those geographical precinct lines, breaking the county down into individual precincts, and each precinct is allowed to have one person on the county executive committee, and each precinct is also allowed to have their own precinct level GOP organization. It's a small miniature version of your county party. It's your precinct party, essentially, that's made up of you and your neighbors. You choose from one of yourselves to be the president of the precinct, and you can pretty much do whatever you want to with that precinct. Many precincts across the state do nothing except meet once every 2 years to choose who the delegates to the convention are going to be. But there are other precincts that have been extremely active. I know of one precinct in Spartanburg County has actually become a local activist hub, led by Rob Harris, who's newly elected to the South Carolina House, defeated Rita Allison up there. So that's just one example. He's not the only one doing that. There are some like that in several, very active precinct presidents in Greenville, probably some in the Low Country as well. So, you can take that and you can use that however you like. And I hope that people will take it and use it in a way that mobilizes conservatives to put pressure on bad legislators to get on board with the good stuff that we want. But when we say precinct, we're literally talking about voting precinct. And there is a map that you can get that shows all the lines of all those precincts, but they break down each county into, a bunch of little small pieces, basically.
Thank you. And then there's a couple questions. Can you talk about Title 44?
Title 44?
Yeah.
Let me pull up the code of laws and see what we're talking about here. Title 44, that's the health code. Did someone have there's a lot of chapters in there. There's actually 139 chapters. Was there a particular topic you're interested in?
Angela? I don't know if you're by the computer. You just leave her with her? No.
Okay, maybe she
Right.
dropped off, or
Yeah, Angela, if you hear it, just come back and then.
Oh,
let us know.
vaccine mandates. I see the comment in the chat now. Vaccine mandates. So, yes, very good question. So one of the issues there is that this is definitely an area in which our laws in South Carolina are very, very lacking. In fact, the laws actually give DHEC a lot of power and ability to forcibly quarantine and forcibly vaccinate anyone, and it doesn't even have to be during a public health emergency. So these broad, far-reaching powers were implemented in the wake of 9/11, because at the time, if you may recall, there was a lot of concerns about bioweapons, being used by terrorists to, as weapons of mass destruction, and legislators at the time used that to grab a bunch of power for DHEC, which again itself is not particularly accountable to anyone, and gave them all these powers to do what they feel like they need to in order to keep the public health, protect public health. Those need to go. I have filed legislation on that. I've also filed amendments to other bills on that, trying to get rid of those broad health emergency powers. That would be an excellent bill for someone to file. Hint, hint, Jordan. But that would be a good bill for someone to file and pursue that and continue doing that. Bills don't just pass just because somebody filed them, and bills don't just pass just because somebody pushed them. You have to have a sustained and organized effort over time, sometimes through multiple elections, in order to get controversial bills like that passed. Now, as far as I know, these broad emergency powers have never actually been used by DHEC. I was waiting on them to spring these things out and start using them during COVID, and they never did. I think in part we dodged a bullet because DHEC was in shambles. The director of DHEC was MIA for a big part of the COVID pandemic, and his second in command was kind of running things behind the scenes. But that agency has been a dumpster fire for a while now, and it's actually good for liberty and freedom if they continue to be a dumpster fire. So just throwing that out there. The less they do, the better, as far as I'm concerned. But yes, in Title 44, there's some broad health powers that need to go away, that need to get stripped out. There was nothing in place that clearly allows for an exemption, except there was something in DHEC regulations regarding the ability to apply for a religious exemption for kids in school. But that is where you'll find some of the mandates that do exist. Definitely the ability for DHEC to enforce anything like that. And there was a House bill, a rather weak bill, passed in special session at the end of 2021, I believe it was, in December of 2021, right as the OSHA mandates were going into effect. It was too little too late. I don't think there was a single job saved by passing House Bill 3126, but it did amend Title 44, and it did start putting into place some vaccination mandate protections, but at the same time, it actually encouraged other vaccine mandates by basically promising immunity to business owners that can fully comply with official public health guidelines. So I was very outspoken about that. Unfortunately, we lost that fight, but someone needs to come back and take another whack at it. They're going to keep trying. After all, I think we all know that they're going to keep trying to take our medical freedom from us.
I think the religious exemptions is
just
coming.
Wait till Moderna comes out with their mRNA universal flu vaccine and see what the legislature does with that.
So what do you think would be the best next step from here for activists?
Well, I mean, that's a broad question. I think probably best next step would be figure out what it is that you most care about that you're willing to actually work on. Pick just one issue. You know, a lot of people want to work on all the issues, and you can't. You physically can't. There isn't the time, there isn't the money or the energy to do that. So pick one thing. Is it medical freedom? Is it election integrity? Is it life? Is it gun rights? Whatever, you know, whatever it is, pick something, make a plan, come up with a bill. And you might be thinking, wait, I thought legislators write bills. No, legislators don't write bills. They don't even read the bills. Somebody else writes them and somebody else reads them. They just do what they're told and vote for them when the time comes. And that's bad. And that's what we want to change. And that means, and Michelle's nodding because she's actually written a bill at my encouragement. So thank you for doing that. You should go and do that. So find an issue you care about, work on it, come up with legislation. If you want to work with me on that, I'm glad to consult and give you my advice, my 2 cents. But find a friendly legislator like Jordan or someone else that's willing to file it for you, and then start actively pushing people to contact their legislators and contact the committee and make them vote on it. Because if you don't, the bill's just going to die, and it's not going to go anywhere. So
Well, I was just gonna say, I was nodding because you're right, the legislators don't read the bills.
That's
That's
the most important thing.
and that's not new to South Carolina. There was a California state senator from several decades ago. He was a conservative by the name of H.L. Richardson. And he wrote a book with the tongue-in-cheek title, "What Makes You Think We Read the Bills?" So there's nothing new under the sun, unfortunately. You can work with your local party. If your local party wants to work on conservative things, then by all means work with them to make that happen. If you've got a local party organization at the precinct level that you control, then with or without these state or local parties, state or county parties' blessing, you can take that and you can use it to advance your agenda. And I encourage you to do that. Canvass your neighbors, find the ones that agree with you on the issue and want to work with you. Meet with them, mobilize them, start putting pressure on your legislator. If your legislator won't listen, then immediately pivot to running against him in the next election. Either you or somebody that you find in your area to do that. And then help them with a campaign plan, help them knock on doors, raise money for the campaign, whatever is needed. If you do that, I guarantee you that legislator is going to stop ignoring you in a hurry. And they're going to do one or two things. They're either going to get on board with what you want, or they're going to keep resisting. And if they keep resisting, then that means you have to keep doubling down until one or two things happen. Either they cave or they get voted out. And that is the definition of true political power, is the ability to make a legislator do what you want them to do, or replace them with someone else who will. It's not going to happen overnight. And we need to stop with the hand wringing and the panic and the hyperventilating. And we need to think rationally and professionally. We need to take charge of our government. And we need to go and, start working on becoming politically powerful.
And it's true that legislators here get nervous when they get 15, 20 phone calls.
They do. That is
Well-
an extremely rare thing to happen to a state legislator.
Where us in New York, we're used to having to do hundreds to get them even just a little bit nervous, barely. Here,
Right.
it's only 15, 20.
Right. They're a lot more sensitive to pressure here. I would agree with that. And that's to your advantage.
Hey, I have a question.
Sure.
It's Dave Cook. I'm in Hilton Head.
Hi, Dave.
I met you up in Somerville when you were up there about a month ago.
Yeah.
So with election results fresh in the data is all fresh. I was thinking now's a good time to go in and take a good look. For example, our representative, Jeff Bradley, ran basically unopposed But I'm thinking for anyone that's looking at trying to make that move to connect with their legislators, go in and see how many votes they got, and see what you're up against as far as what do you need to help them see the light, I guess, as they put it.
You're absolutely right about that. And in fact, I am going to be on a call tomorrow with some allies that I've been working with on constitutional carry to do that very thing, to reevaluate the lay of the land here after the election to see what we're up against for the next session. So you're absolutely right there. You know, your first step is figuring out, you know, what issue you're going to work on, what specific political issue. And then second, what approach to that issue are you going to take? Are you going to do like Michelle said and try to repeal a bad law, or are you going to try to pass a good law, or whatever? Or do you anticipate, you know, the legislature trying to push a bad bill down our throats that we have to stop? Whatever the case is, figure out what the issue is, what you hope to accomplish on that issue, and then make a list of all the legislators and do as best as you can ascertain where each one of those stand on the issue. Some are going to be, you know, with us to the point that we're certain that they will vote with us, and we don't even have to ask them to. There will be a handful like that. There will be
I
some.
appreciate that.
Yeah, for sure. I wish they were all like that, but there are a few like that. There are some on the opposite side of that who, you know, we can 100% be certain will vote against us on the issue no matter what we do. And so those are two groups of people we can set aside. We don't have to spend any time or energy on those. Then we have a group of people who say they'll vote with us because they've said so on social media, or they've said so in their campaign literature or their campaign website or in speeches they've made. But they'll probably need some pressure to make good on and put their votes where their mouth is and actually take action on the things they said they'd take action on. And then there's a group of people that probably will vote against us, but might respond to pressure, you know, from our side of the issue. They're less diehard against us as the earlier group I mentioned. And then you've got a final group in the middle where you don't know where they stand. They won't say where they stand. They don't have an established voting record on the issue that you can look at. And they give dodgy answers, or they refuse to answer the question, or whatever. And those people will need pressure as well. So, you know, you can definitely take that list of 124 House members and 48 senators, and you can definitely whittle it down. And you may find that key votes are right in your area. You know, if you're in the Charleston area, there's a good likelihood that some key lawmakers in the House and in the Senate on the issues you care about are in your area, and you're in a prime position in the state to, you know, become an election threat to them and force them to take notice of your issue and start taking action on it.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And thanks for doing this. I've enjoyed it. It's good to get the refresher, even though it's a month out.
Well, thanks. Appreciate it. Is there another question?
Someone wants to know, what if their legislator is a Democrat? What advice would you give them?
Well, that may or may not be a bad thing. It depends on what the issue is. In South Carolina, there are some somewhat conservative Democrats in the state house, at least. They're not all AOCs, so that's for sure. So again, it depends on the issue. If it's a transparency issue, you may find that they're an ally on that. If it's a medical freedom issue, you may or may not find them to be an ally on that. So, you know, you need to just like approach it like you would any other legislator. First of all, research what they've actually done. Look at their actual votes. That'll tell you more than anything else. Then if that doesn't, if you can't find anything to work with there in terms of roll call votes that they've cast, then look at what they have put in on the record in terms of via their campaign. Look at their social media, look at their website, look for recorded, video or audio speeches that they've made, statements in the newspaper, to see as an indication of where they stand on the issue. Also look for bills that they have co-sponsored or not co-sponsored. That'll give you some indication as well. And, they still deserve to hear from you. Even if they probably disagree with you on the issue, still contact them. But, they're definitely check the lay of the land and see if there might be other legislators that will be more responsive to you. So there have been some Democrats taken out of office already. 5 Democrat House members lost their seats to Republicans this month. Only 1 Republican lost to a Democrat this month. So, I would tend to think that Democrats going forward are probably going to feel a little nervous. They probably feel like even the ones that used to be in safe districts are probably in less safe districts now, which means they may be realizing that they're going to have to start listening to some people like you if they want to stay in office. So don't make it about party. It doesn't really matter what party they are. In fact, I'll be honest with you, I'd rather have a Democrat that's honest about the fact that they aren't with us on medical freedom than a Republican who lies with us about being with us on medical freedom, if that makes sense. I'd rather have a honest Democrat than a lying Republican, because at least I know where they stand. So, just do your homework, talk to them, interact with them, and you'll get a sense for where they are now and where you might be able to push them, if that makes sense.
Does anybody
And
else have any
if you were to find someone who agrees with you on the issue that might be willing to run against them in the Democrat primary, by all means, make that happen. We can primary Republicans, we can also primary Democrats. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with doing that. So, just be open-minded and consider all the options and try to be creative in how you approach things. All right, well, we're coming up on 9 o'clock. If there's any other questions, I'd be happy to take them. Otherwise, I want to be respectful of your time. Is there anything in the comments that I didn't get to, Tiffany?
I don't think so. I think we're pretty good. Does anybody else have any other questions before we get off? You could just unmute yourself. Oh, mute MUSC board
MUSC board.
appointments.
Guess who appoints people to the MUSC board?
Oh, goodness.
The legislature.
Get out of here, really?
I'm 100% serious. All the boards of all the state-run and state-funded colleges and universities, including MUSC, are legislative appointments. The House and Senate get together and have a joint election to fill those vacancies. And before that can even happen, a panel of legislators gets together and decides who can even be a candidate for that position. It's the exact same process we use for selecting our judges, and it is corrupt. It is so corrupt. It is something that needs to go away. It goes back to that 1895 Constitution and lawyer legislators' appetites for picking the judges that they're going to practice in front of and creating monopolies for themselves, legal monopolies for themselves in the state, enriching themselves, keeping control over, what even goes on in the courtroom. So legislative influence is even present there in the courtroom oftentimes. And it's because of this. So Lexington Medical Board, I don't know about that one. So that is not a state entity. So it's not something that the state legislature as a whole would pick, but it may be something that the local Lexington legislative delegation might have some control over. That would be something you would need to research further. I don't have the answer to that.
What about DHEC?
So with DHEC, they are run by a board, and I'm trying to recall who appoints the board, and right now I fail to recall. Some of these boards and
I think with
commissions are
DHEC
chosen by the legislature as a whole. Some of the boards and commissions are appointed by the governor. Some of the boards and commissions are appointed by committee chairman, believe it or not. So someone
Board of
saying
Health?
just the governor.
Yeah, the Board of Health is appointed by the governor, but I believe they're confirmed by
Confirmed by the Senate.
the Senate. Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, that's another problem. It's inconsistent. It's, you have one way for the Transportation Commission, another way for DHEC, another way for, Department of Revenue, and so forth and so on. It should be unified.
Just to add some more appointments, don't forget the judges.
Yes. And there is a judicial election coming up in January. At least one seat on the state Supreme Court is up. In addition to that, there's usually actually 2 judicial elections per year, one in January or February and one in April or May. So that's another whole thing. If you're interested in what I've done on trying to bring transparency to that process, you can check my website, votehill.com. I did a lot of things trying to bring attention to the fact that the legislature was basically rigging elections behind the scenes for judges. So there's some articles and videos that I've posted there if you're interested in checking that out.
One thing that I wanted to ask about, but it may be a whole nother topic, obviously, is in parental rights and researching some things. I recognize a few issues, and maybe you could speak about them as well. Mandated reporters is actually a big problem, especially with the gender affirming issues that are going on throughout the country. And as well as, the horrible laws that are related in the schools with the Title 59 as well, with the curriculums and having the teachers, discuss their belief system without us even seeing it, parents seeing it. But going back to the mandated, I think they're mandated reporters. I was watching a video on it and I was pretty shocked about it. The laws pertaining to that are very open.
Yes, yes, they
so
are.
I don't know if you want to share that as well.
Yeah, there was one situation where a bill dealing with changing the list of mandatory reporters did come up during my time in office, and that was certainly something we really scrutinized at the time. Turned out to be seemingly benign. I don't remember who exactly was being added to that list, but the problem is the list is a long list, and on top of that, the definitions of abuse can be made to mean a lot of different things, and especially as we're redefining terms, and we have gender affirming models of care being introduced into the system, or affirmative care models.
Yeah, the law included mental health as well.
And I don't think those are things that the state laws as they are right now necessarily anticipated. Who would have guessed 10 years ago even that we would be here today? So those are all things that need to be factored in carefully. And as we've said, as we've talked about Parental Bill of Rights or any other bill that we try to draft, vetting is extremely important. Getting as many knowledgeable people, qualified people to review this and examine it for possible unintended consequences is very important. And we've got to do our homework on that front if we want the good bill to actually do what we hope for it to accomplish. David, I think you had your hand raised, it looks
Yeah.
like.
Yeah, I had, we are, it's just starting to come into play now this year again with sexual abuse education and Aaron's law. And this is, repeatedly, they fail to provide us with any kind of curriculum. And when we request it, they just say, oh, sorry, it's a third-party vendor that's been approved by the state. So is there any way to get our hands on that stuff in advance? I don't mean like a day before, like I had to do in March this past year.
I think freedom of
honestly,
information requests are probably your friend if it comes to, the agreement with the vendor, for instance. That should be something you should be able to get your hands on. If it comes to, invoices to see what the state is actually purchasing and paying them for, that would be something you could request with a FOIA. And then, there's probably other avenues. I know you have worked with local teachers and talked with them directly about materials they're putting in front of kids.
Yeah.
So
I appreciate that. Thank you. That's great information, actually.
yeah. I should mention that when it comes to state procurement, in general, that is run under the Department of Administration, which is run by the governor's office. But many procurement decisions are not up to the governor's office. They are run through a board called the State Fiscal Accountability Authority, which is a holdover from the old Budget and Control Board. And it's made up of the governor, the treasurer, the comptroller general, the House Ways and Means Committee chairman, and the Senate Finance chairman. So, once again, giving those people even more power. Legislators in particular, even more power over an area of executive responsibility. All right, well, I think we'll bring things to a close here. And I really appreciate your hanging with me here and listening and for your interest. I hope that this has been helpful, and I hope that it inspires you to go and do good things in your areas. Let me just tell you that, as a state legislator, former state legislator, people like you guys are our bread and butter. I mean, without you, we're totally dead in the water, especially going up against the good old boy network and the establishment machine. So thank you. Please do everything that you can to help the new guys that are coming into office, as will I. And I'm here for you. If you need to get in contact with me directly, if you don't already have my number, Tiffany, you're welcome to give that to anyone that asks. It's always been public. I don't mind putting that out there, so it's not hard to find. So I'm happy to chat with you on the phone or text or email or whatever's convenient to answer questions and brainstorm and whatever else. So thank you. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your week and wonderful holiday season. And let's get ready for some good things next year.
Thank you
Thank
again,
you.
Jonathan. I mean, I know we've said it 15,000 times, but seriously, we appreciate you very
Well,
much.
Yes,
Happy to
very
help.
much.
All righty. Well, you guys have a good
Take
night.
care.
You
Thanks.
too.